There's nothing quite like a situational horror about freezing to death while trapped on a ski lift during a snowstorm, while below your dangling hopeless feet are ravenous wolves, to truly get you into the holiday spirit. That's basically what we're dealing with when it comes to Adam Green's 2010 survival horror Frozen. Now, truth be told, as twisted as it may seem, there are many better options when it comes to movies about freezing to death or dealing with hungry wolves, such as The Grey. However, I'm at that point in the year where I'm just done dealing with anything thematically heavy-hitting after what the Mothman prophecies put me through, so we're going to end the year a little looser with a film that's far from perfect, but still has many impactful ingredients. Frozen tells the story of a princess called Anna, who befriends an Iceman, a talking reindeer, and sentient snowman, while on a journey to find her sister trapped in a nope. That's my cousin's DVD. Frozen tells the story of three characters, Parker, Dan, and Joe. Come on, you knew that joke was coming, right? Who, in the midst of a skiing weekend in New England, get accidentally trapped on a ski lift when a negligent, albeit completely oblivious employee shuts down the resort, causing them to endure a harsh snowstorm whilst trying to figure out how to get down. What truly cements it as a rather effectively chilling man vs. wild elemental horror is really just how horribly simple it all is. There's no big twist or cinematic revelation, and the characters themselves are pretty ordinary, but amidst the persistent tension and some grueling body horror is a subtly modest psychological drama. It's very much presented as a random freak accident that you'd hear about locally or on social media that is so tragically low-key that it quickly becomes a faint memory relative to everything we fixate on in the news. To be honest, I can already hear people detach from the suspension of disbelief to say something about how this would never happen due to various factors, but if reality has shown us anything, it's that these tragedies do happen time and time again. Deep down, what's supposed to get under your skin is less so the harsh conditions these characters face, and more so that raw, nihilistic sentiment that nature does not give a fuck about your feelings. Sometimes nobody is coming to save you. You are unimportant to what the wilderness may throw at you. As Parker cries out late into the film, everything about what's happening is simply unfair. Now, if that's left you feeling depressed and put off by the idea of watching it, I will say it's not entirely a hopeless endeavour. Without giving too much away just yet, there is a subtly thought-provoking aftertaste to where things end up that stop it from just being straight up mean-spirited, even if I am conflicted with several aspects of it, but we'll get to that eventually, so until then, brace yourself. Now, before we dive deeper into despair, this video is sponsored by Raycon. Christmas is finally here, and there's no better holiday gift for anyone who made your nice list than Raycon's everyday earbuds. A must-have for any audio lover, Raycon's everyday earbuds have received tens of thousands of 5-star reviews, and their latest model is better than ever, with a 32-hour battery life and multi-point functionality that lets you pair with 2 devices at once. I'm particularly a big fan of their active noise cancellation, which blocks out surrounding sounds, so I can better immerse myself in music and engrossing podcasts while walking my doggo Cheddar through the winter landscape, which honestly in itself helps take my mind off my freezing limbs. I'm also forever grateful of their quick charge functionality, where 10 minutes of charging yields 90 minutes of playtime, because I'm sure many can relate to forgetting to charge their devices overnight, so in a last-ditch effort, Raycon gives you enough juice to get you through the day. If you're getting Raycon's everyday earbuds as a holiday gift, now is the time to order, because the cutoff date to ensure you get them before Christmas is December 15th, and if your receiver isn't as impressed as I am, Raycon also offers a 30-day happiness guarantee and easy returns. So why not take the hassle out of gift buying for yourself and your loved ones by going to buyraycon.com/Ryan to save big for the holidays and get up to 25% off site-wide. The film opens with strikingly intense mechanical noises and close-ups of the ski lift machinery before abruptly cutting to a flat title screen to fittingly establish and foreshadow the harshness of its horror. It's then immediately contrasted with generic teen pop-punk music and almost satirically cliché rom-com characters, as though playing off those hokey 80s ski comedies. The only noteworthy detail is how Parker, Dan, and Joe's vapid shenanigans are almost entirely overshadowed by the brooding distractions of the clunky ski lift, as Parker is convinced by Dan to use her charm, sexuality, and a $100 bill to convince the ski supervisor to let them bunk the queue. There's tension established between Dan and Joe, whose lifelong friendship has grown strained ever since the former started dating Parker and is now seemingly grown cocky and arrogant. It's a detail that's loosely addressed throughout, as Joe is portrayed as a more thoughtful and sympathetic character who's struggling with deep insecurities that prevent him from finding a partner he can connect with. The reason I get the cliche 80s ski rom-com vibe, besides a stylistic choice I'll talk about soon, is because Joe is distinctly at odds with how many bro-dude frat boys he seems to be surrounded by, including Dan, as though he's going through some sort of masculine crisis where, because his sensitivity doesn't align with the bravado of other males who seem to have it all, that's why he can't get a girlfriend? It's not that deep, if anything it's shallow, but it does lean into that antiquated trope of sheepish male protagonists not falling for what a man ought to be under the stigma of youth. It's ultimately an irrelevant factor, but nonetheless it makes a decent attempt to add some emotional complexity to Joe, because you sure as hell don't get anything more eye-opening from the other characters, besides maybe the extremely brief reveal from Dan later in the film that he's actually just as sensitive as Joe, but does a much better job at hiding it. All you need to know is Dan is a dick, Joe is sincere and should be protected, and Parker is a bit of an empty vessel I wish was explored better given the toxic relationship she has with Dan. With Parker, she claims to love Dan and sees him as the one, but he's a super controlling and domineering personality who Parker even calls out at one point for lacking in sweetness and gestures of warmth, and instead is too wrapped up in his cold, I listen to Joe Rogan vibe. Anyway, later that night, they convince the ski operator to let them ride one more time before the slopes close, but as they ascend, the operator switches with another employee so he can get his shifts changed with the manager, but not before telling his replacement that 3 people still need to descend. However, as luck would have it, the employee understandably mistakes the wrong 3 people who arrive shortly after and shuts down the slopes, accidentally leaving the trio trapped halfway up. At first, the characters assume it's just a common stoppage because ski lifts typically stop to aid the traffic on the slopes, but soon suspect a malfunction before the lights go out, thus coming to the realization they've been forgotten. The film really makes the most with so little. You've got the fear of heights, the cold, the dark, being abandoned in the wilderness, uncertain when and if help will ever arrive, and of course, worst of all, the desperate need to pee. However, it's the emotional intensity that makes the situation difficult to swallow. While you have Parker panicking, Joe trying to desperately reassure them, and Dan growing angry, it's the mental confusion and humanly poor decision making that stands out the most. I made a video on this a very long time ago, but I'm an apologist for dumb decisions in horror movies depending on the context, and right here is the perfect scenario where rationality rightfully goes out the window when hypothermia well and truly settles in. Because of the cold, they become increasingly disorientated, which is only compounded by the fact they literally cannot move, so panic and desperation without logically thinking things through was bound to arise eventually. There is one occasion where they try to get the attention of a snowplow but fail to do so, leaving them to face a snowstorm that Parker describes as if being hit by needles, just to really accentuate the intensity that coldness brings to our mind and bodies. Eventually, Dan shows fake confidence and claims he can make the jump down and go for help, but despite the whole poor arguments under pressure argument, he is fully aware it's a terrible idea, but what choice do they have? So after admitting his own fears, he makes the terrifying plunge with his legs rigidly straight out, and okay, hold on, wait a minute. Before Dan hits the ground and shatters both legs and is left with 2 compound fractures, we should take a moment to address Adam Green a little bit, because there is a potential caveat in here that I think might turn some folks off, and that's how much of the film feels inherently like a bit of a B-movie. So, Adam Green is a really fun director who channels a lot of Sam Raimi and early Peter Jackson, with his most notable claim to fame being the splatter series Hatchet, which are 4 of the most enjoyable gorefests I can recommend. While Frozen doesn't veer anywhere close to the same level of crassness or comedy, it definitely revels in many of Green's pulpy qualities when introducing more brutal elements, but thankfully it never tonally conflicts with the harrowing nature of what's on display. There's a certain, shall we say, prolonged indulgence that's frequent in the Hatchet films where it really likes to rub things in your face using the same harsh close-ups and sounds that echo the machinery we saw in the opening. Again, I wouldn't call it mean-spirited, it's still incredibly restrained and grounded in reality, but the screaming and punchy imagery is very raw and guttural. In fact, a character screaming in agony is more emotionally provocative and long-lasting to me than showing me why they're in agony. It just gets to me on a more human level. Now, I'm pretty confident the pulpiness was a deliberate creative choice because, believe it or not, Frozen is canonically in the same universe as the Hatchet films, but I'll come back to it at the end. Also, just one more thing, there's a missing persons poster you'll briefly see early in the film that you'll have no time to read, but after it describes him and tells you where he was last seen and whatnot, it ends by saying that if you have any information to contact his parents, as they are worried because he owes them $1,280 he borrowed to purchase a drum set. Like, at the very least, it's definitely aware of itself. Anyway, as Dan screams in horrible pain for far longer than I wish I had to endure, his adrenaline eventually kicks in and they begin to diffuse his feelings of shock using humor. I really love this detail because, as I said, while the script itself isn't deep in terms of characterization, the characters themselves react in very naturalistic ways. It might not make for the most seamless, accessible piece of storytelling, and their behaviors can be very off-putting, but the emotionally rapid pace of it feels very realistic. Later scenes see the characters try to converse and argue over pointless things to take their minds away from the cold and increasing fears of death. In fact, the film's score is somber and moody as opposed to conventionally horror-themed to further perpetuate the bleakness of it all. Hell, at one point, Parker breaks into tears at the notion her dog is waiting and wondering when she'll return home and will now likely starve to death. It literally pulls the Futurama Seymour card, "You cannot do this to me movie, get her fucking home." However, returning to Dan, he gets confronted face to face with one pissed off looking wolf that thankfully they manage to scare off, but of course it's only temporary when it suddenly returns with a full-on pack, forcing Dan to accept his fate. He's brutally torn apart, predominantly off-screen, and what makes it so effective outside his screams and the tearing of flesh is when he tells Jo not to let Parker look, as much as she desperately tries to in horror and shock. Yeah, what I love about this tragically simple human gesture is that, for as much as I did not care about Dan as a character, it's an empathetic reminder that I'm still human because I was left utterly disturbed and devastated for the remainder of the film. I've obviously seen much worse deaths in films, but the way he covers his eyes and cries before they attack him, there's a bombshell quality to it where you've been waiting half the movie for the first death scene, and it just hits harder than you'd expect. Things only begin to look increasingly dire when Jo and Parker later fall asleep and she awakens with worsening frostbite and has to peel her frozen hand off the railing she accidentally leans on in her sleep. Eventually, Jo decides to climb along the cable to reach a distant maintenance ladder, which he did previously bail on several times due to slippery conditions and the fact that sliding his hands along the metal cable ate through his gloves. He successfully makes it, albeit with shredded hands, and uses his snowboard to slide down the mountain to get help whilst pursued by wolves, leaving Parker to deal with the ski chair falling apart, to which it soon collapses with just enough resistance that Parker only breaks her leg when the chair crushes it. She proceeds to slide down the mountain in the hopes of reuniting with Jo, and miraculously she actually does, or well, rather what's left of him. Okay, so this twist, if we can call it that, technically works as a bleak shock to the audience. It's a completely unceremonious kill where the wolves manage to catch up with him, and I guess it adds a certain amount of realism, and I like the detail that Parker is sad but just too disorientated and exhausted and desperate to get out of there that she really doesn't take it in. However, it's 2 for 3 with the wolves, and it just doesn't work for me in the same way it did for Dan. For a film centered around the concept of freezing to death, it doesn't seem right to me that the wolves end up a greater antagonist than the cold. I'm not saying my version would be better, but I think if Parker simply found Joe frozen to death having fainted from hypothermia or something like that, might have resonated more strongly than further gore for the sake of shock value. I mean, for all we know, he could have died of hypothermia and the wolves just ate him, but I feel this moment could have done with a less is more approach. I don't know, I just don't think Joe's death quite has the sucker punch it's going for. Nonetheless, I really appreciate that the ending doesn't go fully mean-spirited and kill her off as well, because I like the idea that the story is possibly some sort of personal account of her experiences and what she remembered, hence the fluctuation between heightened specific violence and details and the more minimalist, even borderline ambiguous stuff. What we get instead is much more poignant as she manages to make it to the road and flag down help, but in the back of the car, the driver reassures her that she'll be okay, just as it begins to echo memories of the very same words that Dan told her earlier in the story, as if to say, yeah, she'll be okay in that she's alive at least, but the trauma and physical hardship she's likely going to endure for the rest of her life makes you wonder to what extent being okay actually means.
You're gonna be okay, baby.
Okay, so let's quickly end by addressing that Hatchet cinematic universe. Basically, Hatchet 2 came out later in the same year as Frozen, and there's a brief scene in that film where the protagonist Mary Beth goes to visit Tony Todd, may he rest in peace, and there's a news report where Parker's character has successfully sued the resort. That's it. I'm sure some people will appreciate it. I don't care for these kinds of things. I think if anything it diminishes the ambiguity a little, but I suppose on the bright side she got compensated for her trauma. I don't know. And that's all I really have to say about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. There is one last topic before we end 2024, but until then, stay safe, stay away from ski resorts, send me your requests, and I'll see you all soon. Bye. I thought that was okay.